we present the final instalment of Why Didn't They Ask Evans by Agatha Christie. Episode 8. Chapter 29. Badger's Story. There was not a minute to be lost. Already sounds could be heard on the floor below. "Quick, Badger, you fool! Pull off one of my boots. Don't ask questions or argue. Haul it off somehow. Now chuck it in the middle there and crawl under that bed. Quick, I tell you!" Steps were ascending the stairs. The key turned. Nicholson, the pseudo-Nicholson, stood in the doorway, candle in hand. He saw Bobby and Frankie as he had left them, but in the middle of the floor was a pile of broken glass, and in the middle of the broken glass was a boot. Nicholson stared in amazement from the boot to Bobby. Bobby's left foot was bootless. "Very clever, my young friend. Extremely acrobatic." He came over to Bobby and examined the ropes that bound him. He tied a couple of extra knots. He looked at him curiously. "I wish I knew how you managed to throw that boot through the skylight. It seems almost incredible. A touch of a Houdini about you, my friend. He looked at them both, up at the broken skylight. Then, shrugging his shoulders, he left the room. "Oh, quick, Badger!" Badger crawled out from under the bed. He had a pocket knife, and with its aid he soon cut the other two free. "That's better," said Bobby, stretching himself. "Phew, I'm stiff. Well, Frankie, what about our friend Nicholson?" "You're right. It is Roger Bassington French. Now that I know he's Roger playing the part of Nicholson, I can see it. But it's a pretty good performance all the same." "Entirely voice and pince-nez. I was at Oxford with Bassington French. Marvellous actor. Bad hat, though. There was a bad business about forging his pater's name on a cheque. Old man hushed it up." In the minds of both Bobby and Frankie was the same thought. Badger, whom they had judged it wiser not to take into their confidence, could all along have given them valuable information. "Forgery," said Frankie thoughtfully. "That letter from you, Bobby, was remarkably well done. I wonder how he knew your handwriting." "Well, if he's in with the Caymans, he probably saw my letter about the Evans business." "What are we going to do next?" "We are going to take up a comfortable position behind this door, and when our friend returns, which I imagine won't be for a little while yet, you and I are going to spring on him from behind and give him the surprise of his life. How about it, Badger? Are you game?" "Absolutely." "As for you, Frankie, when you think you hear his step, you'd better get back on your chair. He'll see you as soon as he opens the door. He'll come in without any suspicion." "All right. And once you and Badger have got him down, I'll join in and bite his ankles or something. That's the true womanly spirit. Now, let's all sit close together on the floor here and hear all about things. I want to know what miracle brought Badger through that skylight." "Oh, well, you see, after you went off, I got into a bit of a mess." He paused. Gradually the story was extracted. A tale of liabilities, creditors, and bailiffs. A typical Badger catastrophe. Bobby'd gone off, leaving no address, only saying that he was driving the Bentley down to Staveley, so to Staveley came Badger. "I thought perhaps you might be able to let me have a fiver." Bobby's heart smote him. To aid Badger in his enterprise, he had come to London, and had promptly deserted his post to go off sleuthing with Frankie. And even now the faithful Badger uttered no word of reproach. Badger had no wish to endanger Bobby's mysterious enterprises, but he was of the opinion that a car like the green Bentley would not be difficult to find in a place the size of Staveley. As a matter of fact, he'd come across it almost before he got to Staveley, for it was standing outside a pub, empty. So I thought, I'd give you a little surprise, don't you know. There were some rugs and things in the back and nobody about. I got in, I pulled them over me. I thought, I'll give you the surprise of your life." What actually happened was that a chauffeur in green livery had emerged from the pub, and that Badger, peering through his place of concealment, was thunderstruck to perceive that this chauffeur was not Bobby. He had an idea the face was in some way familiar to him, but he couldn't place the man. The stranger got into the car and drove off. Badger was in a predicament. He did not know what to do next. Explanations and apologies were difficult, and in any case it was not easy to explain to someone who was driving a car at 60 miles an hour. Badger decided to lie low and sneak out of the car when it stopped. The car finally reached its destination, Tudor Cottage. The chauffeur drove it into the garage and left it there, but on going out he shut the garage doors. Badger was a prisoner. There was a small window at one side of the garage, and through this, about half an hour later, Badger had observed Frankie's approach, her whistle too, and her admission into the house. The whole business puzzled Badger greatly. He began to suspect something was wrong. At any rate, he determined to have a look around for himself and see what it was all about. With the help of some tools lying about in the garage, he succeeded in picking the lock of the garage door and set out on a tour of inspection. The windows on the ground floor were all shuttered, but he found that by getting onto the roof he might manage to have a look into some of the upper windows. The roof presented no difficulties. There was a convenient pipe running up the garage, and from the garage roof to the roof of the cottage was an easy climb. In the course of his prowling, Badger came upon the skylight. Nature and Badger's weight had done the rest. Bobby drew a long breath as the narrative came to an end. "All the same, you are a miracle. A singularly beautiful miracle. But for you, Badger, my lad, Frankie and I would have been little corpses in about an hour's time." He gave Badger a condensed account of the activities of himself and Frankie. Towards the end he broke off. "Someone's coming. Get to your post, Frankie. Now then, this is where our play-acting Bassington French gets the surprise of his life." Frankie arranged herself in a depressed attitude on the broken chair. Badger and Bobby stood ready behind the door. The steps came up the stairs. A line of candlelight showed underneath the door. The key was put in the lock and turned. The door swung open. The light of the candle disclosed Frankie drooping dejectedly on her chair. Their jailer stepped through the doorway. Then, joyously, Badger and Bobby sprang. The proceedings were short and decisive. Taken utterly by surprise, the man was knocked down. The candle flew wide and was retrieved by Frankie. And a few seconds later the three friends stood looking down with malicious pleasure at a figure securely bound with the same ropes as had previously secured two of them. "Good evening, Mr. Bassington French," said Bobby. And if the exultation in his voice was a little crude, who shall blame him? "It's a nice night for the funeral." Chapter 30. Escape. The man on the floor stared up at them. His pince-nez had flown off, and so had his hat. There could be no further attempt at disguise. Slight traces of make-up were visible about the eyebrows, but otherwise the face was the pleasant, slightly vacuous face of Roger Bassington French. "Very interesting. I really knew quite well that no man tied up as you were could have thrown a boot through that skylight. But because the boot was there among the broken glass, I took it for cause and effect, and assumed that, though it was impossible, the impossible had been achieved. It's an interesting light on the limitations of the brain." As nobody spoke, he went on, still in the same reflective voice. "So, after all, you've won the round. Most unexpected, and extremely regrettable. I thought I'd got you all fooled nicely." "So you had. You forged that letter from Bobby, I suppose?" "I have a talent that way." "And Bobby?" Lying on his back, smiling agreeably, Roger seemed to take a positive pleasure in enlightening them. "I knew he'd go to the Grange. I only had to wait about in the bushes near the path. I was just behind him when he retreated after rather clumsily falling off a tree. I let the hubbub die down and then got him neatly on the back of the neck with a sandbag. All I had to do was carry him out to where my car was waiting, shove him in the dickey and drive him here. I was at home again before morning." "And Moira? Did you entice her away somehow?" demanded Bobby. Roger chuckled. The question seemed to amuse him. "Forgery's a very useful art, my dear Jones." "You swine!" Frankie intervened. She was still full of curiosity, and their prisoner seemed in an obliging mood. "Why did you pretend to be Dr. Nicholson?" "Why did I now? I think partly the fun of seeing whether I could spoof you both. You were so very sure that poor old Nicholson was in it up to the neck. Just because he cross-questioned you a bit about the details of your accident, in his pompous way. It was an irritating fad of his, accuracy in details.
And really, said Frankie slowly, he was quite innocent?
As a child unborn. But he did me a good turn. He drew my attention to that accident of yours. That and another incident made me realize you mightn't be quite the innocent young thing you seem to be. And then I was standing by you when you telephoned one morning, and I heard your chauffeur's voice say, "Frankie, I've got pretty good hearing." I suggested coming up to town with you, and you agreed, but you were very relieved when I changed my mind. After that, well, it was rather fun seeing you all get worked up about Nicholson. He's a harmless old ass, but he does look exactly like a scientific super-criminal on the films. I thought I might as well keep the deception up. After all, you never know. The best laid plans go wrong, as my present predicament shows.
There's one thing you must tell me. I've been driven nearly mad with curiosity. Who is Evans?
Oh, ha! So you don't know that? He laughed, and laughed again. Oh, that's rather amusing. It shows what a fool one can be.
Meaning us?
No, no. In this case, meaning me. Do you know, if you don't know who Evans is, I don't think I shall tell you. I'll keep that to myself as my own little secret.
The position was a curious one.
They turned the tables on Bassington French, and yet, in some peculiar way, he'd robbed them of their triumph. Lying on the floor, bound and a prisoner, it was he who dominated the situation. "And what are your plans now, may I ask?" Nobody had as yet evolved any plans. Bobby rather doubtfully murmured something about police. "Oh, much the best thing to do. Ring 'em up and hand me over to 'em. The charge will be abduction, I suppose. Well, I can't very well deny that. I shall plead a guilty passion." Frankie reddened.
"And what about the murder?"
"My dear, you haven't any evidence. Positively none. Think it over. You'll see you haven't. Badger, you'd better stay here and keep an eye on him. I shall go down and ring the police."
"You'd better be careful. We don't know how many of them there may be in the house."
"Oh, there's no one but me. I was carrying this through single-handed." Bobby went over and tested the knots. "He's all right. Safe as houses. We'd better all go down together. We can lock the door." "Terribly distrustful, aren't you, my dear chap? There's a pistol in my pocket if you'd like it. It may make you feel happier. It's certainly no good to me in my present position." Ignoring the other's mocking tone, Bobby bent down and extracted the weapon. "Kind of you to mention it. If you want to know, it does make me feel happier." "Good. It's loaded." Bobby took the candle and they filed out of the attic, leaving Roger lying on the floor. Bobby locked the door and put the key in his pocket. He held the pistol in his hand. "I'll go first. We've got to be quite sure and not make a mess of things now." "He's a queer chap, isn't he?" said Badger, with a jerk of his head backwards in the direction of the room they'd left.
"He's a damned good loser," said Frankie.
Even now she was not quite free from the charm of that very remarkable young man, Roger Bassington French. A rather rickety flight of steps led down to the main landing. Everything was quiet. Bobby looked over the banisters. The telephone was in the hall below. "We'd better look in the other rooms first. We don't want to be taken in the rear." Badger flung open each door in turn. Of the 4 bedrooms, 3 were empty. In the 4th, a slender figure was lying on the bed.
"It's Moira!"
cried Frankie. The others crowded in. Moira was lying like one dead, except that her breast moved up and down ever so slightly.
"Is she asleep?" "She's drugged, I think."
She looked round. A hypodermic syringe lay on a little enamel tray on a table near the window. There was also a little spirit lamp and a type of morphia hypodermic needle.
"She'll be all right, I think. But we ought to get a doctor."
"Let's go down and telephone." They adjourned to the hall below. Frankie had a half fear that the telephone wires might be cut, but her fears proved quite unfounded. They got through to the police station quite easily, though they found a good deal of difficulty in explaining matters. The local police station was highly disposed to regard the summons as a practical joke. However, they were convinced at last, and Bobby replaced the receiver with a sigh. He'd explained that they also wanted a doctor, and the police constable promised to bring one along. 10 minutes later a car arrived with an inspector and a constable and an elderly man who had his profession stamped all over him. Bobby and Frankie received them, and after explaining matters once more in a somewhat perfunctory fashion, led the way to the attic. Bobby unlocked the door, then stood dumbfounded in the doorway. For in the middle of the floor was a heap of severed ropes. Underneath the broken skylight a chair had been placed on the bed, which had been dragged out till it was under the skylight. Of Roger Bassington French there was no sign. Bobby, Badger and Frankie were dumbfounded. Talk of Houdini! He must have out-Houdini'd Houdini! How the devil did he cut those cords?
He must have had a knife in his pocket.
Well, even so, how could he get it? Both hands were bound together behind his back. The inspector coughed. All his former doubts had returned. He was more strongly disposed than ever to regard the whole thing as a hoax. Frankie and Bobby found themselves telling a long story which sounded more impossible every minute. The doctor was their salvation. On being taken to the room where Moira was lying, he declared at once she'd been drugged with morphia, or some preparation of opium. He did not consider her condition serious, and thought she would probably wake naturally in 4 or 5 hours' time. He suggested taking her off there and then to a good nursing home in the neighbourhood. To this Bobby and Frankie agreed, not seeing what else could be done. Having given their own names and addresses to the inspector, who appeared to disbelieve utterly in Frankie's, they themselves were allowed to leave Tudor Cottage, and with the assistance of the inspector succeeded in gaining admission to the 7 Stars in the village. Here, still feeling that they were regarded as criminals, they were only too thankful to go to their rooms, a double one for Bobby and Badger, and a very minute single one for Frankie. A few minutes after they'd all retired, a knock came on Bobby's door. It was Frankie.
"I've thought of something. If that fool of a police inspector persists in thinking that we made all this up, at any rate I have got evidence that I was chloroformed."
"Have you? Where?"
"In the coal bucket."
Chapter 31. Frankie asks a question. Exhausted by all her adventures, Frankie slept late the next morning. It was 10:30 when she came down to the small coffee room to find Bobby waiting for her. "Hello, Frankie, here you are at last."
"Don't be so horribly vigorous, dear."
Frankie subsided into a chair. "What do you have? Haddock, eggs, bacon, cold ham?"
"I shall have some toast and weak tea," said Frankie, quelling him. "What is the matter with you?"
"It must be the sandbagging. It's probably broken up adhesions in the brain. I feel absolutely full of pep and vim, and bright ideas too, and a longing to dash out and do things."
"Well, why not dash?"
"I have dashed. I've been to see Inspector Hammond for the last half hour. We'll have to let it go as a practical joke, Frankie, for the moment, but Bobby, I said for the moment. We've got to get to the bottom of this. We're on the right road, and all we've got to do is get down it. We don't want Roger Bassington French for abduction. We want him for murder."
"And we'll get him."
"That's more like it. Drink some more tea."
"How's Moira?"
"Oh, pretty bad. She came round in the most awful state of nerves. Scared stiff, apparently. She's gone up to London, to a nursing home place in Queen's Gate. She says she'll feel safe there. She was terrified here."
"She never did have much nerve."
"Well, anyone would be scared stiff with a queer, cold-blooded murderer like Roger Bassington French loose in the neighbourhood."
"He doesn't want to murder her. We're the ones he's after."
"He's probably too busy taking care of himself to worry about us for the moment. Now, Frankie, we've got to get down to it. The start of the whole thing must be John Savage's death and will. There is something wrong about that. Either it was forged, or Savage was murdered, or something."
"More likely the will's forged if Bassington French was concerned. Forgery seems to be his speciality."
"It may have been forgery and murder. We've got to find out."
"Yes. Well, we'll start from there. I've got the notes I made after looking at the will. The witnesses were Rose Chudley, cook, and Albert Mere, gardener. They ought to be easy to find. Then there are the lawyers who drew it up, Elford and Lee, a very respectable firm, as Mr. Spragg said."
"Right, well, we'll start from there. I think you better take the lawyers. You'll get more out of them than I would. I'll hunt up Rose Chudley and Albert Mere."
"What about Badger?"
"Badger never gets up till lunchtime. You needn't worry about him."
"We must get his affairs straightened out for him sometime. After all, he did save my life."
"They'll soon get tangled again. By the way,
What do you think of this?" He held out a dirty piece of cardboard for inspection. It was a photograph. "Mr. Cayman! Where did you get it?" "Last night. It had slipped down behind the telephone." "Then it seems pretty clear who Mr. and Mrs. Templeton were." "Wait a minute." A waitress had approached, bringing toast. Frankie displayed the photograph. "Do you know who this is?" The waitress regarded the photograph, her head a little on one side. "I've seen that gentleman, but I can't quite call to mind." "Oh, yes, it's the gentleman who had Tudor Cottage, Mr. Templeton. They've gone away now, somewhere abroad, I believe." "What sort of man was he?" "Really couldn't say. They didn't come down here very often, just weekends now and then. Nobody saw much of him. Mrs. Templeton was a very nice lady, but they hadn't had Tudor Cottage very long, only about 6 months, when a very rich gentleman died and left Mrs. Templeton all his money, and they went to live abroad. They never sold Tudor Cottage, though. I think they sometimes lend it to people for weekends, but I don't suppose with all that money they'll ever come back here and live in it themselves. They had a cook called Rose Chudley, didn't they?" But the girl seemed uninterested in cooks. Being left a fortune by a rich gentleman was what really stirred her imagination. In answer to Frankie's question, she replied that she couldn't say, she was sure, and withdrew, carrying an empty toast rack. "Well, that's all plain sailing. The Caymans have given up coming here, but they keep the place for the convenience of the gang." They agreed to divide the labour as Bobby had suggested. Frankie went off in the Bentley, having smartened herself up by a few local purchases, and Bobby went off in quest of Albert Mear, the gardener. They met at lunchtime. "Well?" Frankie shook her head. "Forgery's out of the question. I spent a long time with Mr. Elford. He's rather an old dear. He got wind of our doings last night, and he was wild to hear a few details. I don't suppose they get much excitement down here. Anyway, I soon got him eating out of my hand. Then I discussed the Savage case, pretended I'd met some of the Savage relations, and that they'd hinted at forgery. At that my old dear bristled up, absolutely out of the question. It wasn't a question of letters or anything like that. He saw Mr. Savage himself, and Mr. Savage insisted on the will being drawn up there and then. Mr. Elford wanted to go away and do it properly. You know, sheets and sheets, all about nothing. I don't know. I've never made any wills. I have, too. The second was this morning. I had to have some excuse to see a lawyer." "Who did you leave the money to?" "You." "That was a bit thoughtless, wasn't it? If Roger Bassington French succeeds in bumping you off, I'll probably be hanged for it." "I never thought of that. Well, as I was saying, Mr. Savage was so nervous and wrought up that Mr. Elford wrote out the will there and then, and the servant and the gardener came and witnessed it, and Mr. Elford took it away with him for safekeeping. It does seem to knock out forgery. I know. You can't have forgery when you've actually seen the man sign his name. As to the other business, murder, it's going to be hard to find out anything about that now. The doctor who was called in has died since. The man we saw last night's a new one. He's only been there about 2 months. What an unfortunate number of deaths." "Who else is dead?" "Albert Mear." "You think they've all been put out of the way?" "It seems rather wholesale. We might give Albert Mear the benefit of the doubt, though. He was 72, poor old man." "All right. I'll allow you natural causes in his case. But any luck with Rose Chudley?" "Yes. After she left the Templetons, she went to the north of England to a place. But she's come back and married a man down here whom it seems she was walking out with for the past 17 years. Unfortunately, she's a bit of a nitwit. She doesn't seem to remember anything about anyone. Perhaps you could do something with her." "I'll have a go. I'm rather good with nitwits. Where's Badger, by the way?" "Good Lord, I'd forgotten all about him." Bobby got up and left the room, returning a few minutes later. "He was still asleep. He's getting up now. A chambermaid seems to have called him 4 times, but it didn't make any impression." "Well, we'd better go and see the nitwit. And then I must buy a toothbrush and a nightgown, and a sponge, and a few other necessities of civilized existence. I was so close to nature last night I didn't think about any of them. I just stripped off my outer covering and fell upon the bed." "I know, so did I." "Let's go and talk to Rose Chudley." Rose Chudley, now Mrs. Pratt, lived in a small cottage that seemed to be overflowing with china dogs and furniture. Mrs. Pratt herself was a bovine-looking woman of ample proportions, with fish-like eyes and every indication of adenoids. "You see, I've come back," said Bobby breezily. Mrs. Pratt breathed hard and looked at them both incuriously. "We were so interested to hear that you'd lived with Mrs. Templeton,"
explained Frankie.
Yes, ma'am. She's living abroad now, I believe, continued Frankie, trying to give an impression of being an intimate of the family.
I've heard so.
You were with her some time, weren't you?
Were I which, ma'am?
With Mrs. Templeton some time.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that, ma'am. Only 2 months.
Oh, I thought you'd been with her longer than that.
Oh, that was Gladys, ma'am, the house parlour-maid. She was there 6 months.
There were 2 of you?
That's right. House parlour-maid she was, and I was cook.
You were there when Mr. Savage died, weren't you?
I beg your pardon, ma'am?
You were there when Mr. Savage died?
Oh, Mr. Templeton didn't die. At least I haven't heard so. He went abroad. Not Mr. Templeton, Mr. Savage. Mrs. Pratt looked at him vacantly.
The gentleman who left all the money, said Frankie.
A gleam of something like intelligence passed across Mrs. Pratt's face. Oh, yes, ma'am. The gentleman there was the inquest on.
That's right. He used to come and stay quite often, didn't he?
I couldn't say to that, ma'am. I'd only just come, you see. Gladys would know.
But you had to witness his will, didn't you?
Mrs. Pratt looked blank.
You went and saw him sign a paper, and you had to sign it too?
Again the gleam of intelligence. Yes, ma'am, me and Albert. I've never done such a thing before, and I didn't like it. I said to Gladys, I don't like signing a paper, and that's a fact. And Gladys, well, she said it must be all right, because Mr. Elford was there. He was a very nice gentleman, as well as being a lawyer. What happened exactly? I beg your pardon, sir?
Who called you to sign your name?
Oh, the mistress. She came into the kitchen and said, would I go outside and call Albert, and would we both come up to the best bedroom, which she'd moved out of for the gentleman, the night before. And there was the gentleman sitting up in bed. He'd come back from London and gone straight to bed. He looked very ill. I hadn't seen him before, but he looked something ghastly. And Mr. Elford was there too, and he spoke very nice, and said there was nothing to be afraid of, and I was to sign my name where the gentleman signed his. Oh, I did. I put Cook after it and the address. Albert did the same. And then I went down to Gladys, all of a tremble. I said, I've never seen a gentleman look so like death. Gladys said he'd looked all right the night before, and it must be something in London that had upset him. He'd gone up to London very early before anyone was up. And then I said about not liking to write my name to anything, and Gladys said it was all right because Mr. Elford was there.
And Mr. Savage, the gentleman, died. When?
Next morning as ever was, ma'am. He shut himself up in his room that night and wouldn't let anyone go near him. Then Gladys called him in the morning. He was all stiff and dead. There was a letter propped up by his bedside. To the coroner, it said. It gave Gladys a real turn. And then there was the inquest and everything. About 2 months later, Mrs. Templeton told me she was going abroad to live, but she gave me a very good place up north with big wages, and she gave me a nice present and everything. A very nice lady, Mrs. Templeton. Mrs. Pratt was by now beginning to enjoy her loquacity. Frankie rose.
Well, it's been very nice to hear all this.
She slipped a note out of her purse.
You must let me leave you a little present. I've taken up so much of your time.
Well, thank you kindly, I'm sure, ma'am. Good day to you and your good gentleman. Frankie blushed and retreated rather rapidly. Bobby followed her after a few minutes. He looked preoccupied. Well, we seem to have got all she knows.
Yes, and it hangs together. There seems no doubt Savage did make that will, and I suppose his fear of cancer was genuine enough. They couldn't very well bribe a Harley Street doctor. I suppose they just took advantage of his having made that will and did away with him as quickly as they could before he changed his mind. But how we or anyone else can prove that, I can't see.
I know. We may suspect that Mrs. T gave him something to make him sleep, but we can't prove it. Bassington French may have forged the letter to the coroner, but that again we can't prove by now. I expect the letter's destroyed long after being put in as evidence at the inquest.
So we come back to the old problem. What on earth are Bassington French and Co. so afraid of our discovering?
Nothing strikes you as odd, particularly?
No, I don't think so. Or at least only one thing. Why did Mrs. Templeton send out for the gardener to come and witness the will when the house parlourmaid was in the house? Why didn't they ask the parlourmaid?
It's odd you saying that, Frankie.
Why?
Because I stayed behind to ask Mrs. Pratt for Gladys's name and address.
Well?
The parlourmaid's name was Evans. Frankie gasped. You see, you've asked the same question that Carstairs asked. Why didn't they ask the parlourmaid? Why didn't they ask Evans?
Oh, Bobby, we're getting there at last.
The same thing must have struck Carstairs. He was nosing around, just as we were, looking for something fishy, and this point struck him as it struck us. And moreover, I believe he came to Wales for that reason. Gladys Evans is a Welsh name. Evans was probably a Welsh girl. He was following her to Marchbolt, and someone was following him, and so he never got to her.
Why didn't they ask Evans? There must be a reason. It's such a silly little point, yet it's important. With a couple of maids in the house, why send out for a gardener?
Perhaps because both Chudley and Albert Mere were chumps, whereas Evans was rather a sharp girl.
It can't be only that. Mr. Elford was there, and he's quite shrewd. Bobby, the whole situation is there. I know it is. If we could only just get to a reason. Evans. Why Chudley and Mere, and not Evans?
Suddenly she stopped and put both hands over her eyes.
It's coming. Just a sort of flicker. It'll come in a minute.
She stayed dead still for a minute or two, then removed her hands and looked at her companion with an odd flicker in her eyes.
Bobby, if you're staying in a house with 2 servants, which do you tip?
The house parlourmaid, of course. One never tips a cook. One never sees her, for one thing.
No, and she never sees you. Well, she may catch a glimpse of you if you are there some time, but a house parlourmaid waits on you at dinner and calls you and hands you coffee.
What are you getting at, Frankie?
Why couldn't have Evans witnessed that will? Because Evans would have known it wasn't Mr. Savage who was making it.
Good Lord! What do you mean, Frankie? Who was it then?
Bassington French, of course. Don't you see? He impersonated Savage.
I bet it was Bassington French who went to the doctor and made all that fuss about having cancer. Then the lawyer is sent for, a stranger who doesn't know Mr. Savage, but who will be able to swear he saw Mr. Savage sign that will, and it be witnessed by 2 people, one of whom hadn't seen him before, and the other an old man who was probably pretty blind and probably never saw Savage anyway.
Now do you see?
But where was the real Savage all that time?
Oh, he arrived all right, and then I suspect they drugged him, put him in the attic perhaps, kept him there for 12 hours while Bassington French did his impersonation stunt. Then he was put back in his bed and given chloral, and Evans finds him dead in the morning.
My God, I believe you've hit it, Frankie. But can we prove it?
Yes.
No.
Oh, I don't know. Suppose Rose Chudley, Pratt, I mean, was shown a photograph of a real Savage. Would she be able to say that wasn't the man who signed the will?
I doubt it. She's such a nitwit.
Chosen for that purpose, I expect. But there's another thing. An expert ought to be able to detect the signature's a forgery.
They didn't before.
Well, nobody raised the question. It didn't seem any possible moment when the will could have been forged. But now it's different.
One thing we must do. Find Evans. She may be able to tell us a lot. She was with the Templetons 6 months, remember?
That's going to make it even more difficult.
How about the post office? They were just passing it. In appearance it was more of a general store than a post office. Frankie darted inside and opened the campaign. There was no one else in the shop except the postmistress, a young woman with an inquisitive nose. Frankie bought a 2-shilling book of stamps, commented on the weather, and then said,
"But I expect you always have better weather here than we do in my part of the world. I live in Wales, Marchbolt. You wouldn't believe the rain we have."
The young woman with the nose said they had a good deal of rain themselves, and last Bank Holiday it had rained something cruel.
"There's someone in Marchbolt who comes from this part of the world. I wonder if you know her. Her name was Evans, Gladys Evans."
The young woman was quite unsuspicious.
"Of course, she was in service here at Tudor Cottage. She didn't come from these parts. She came from Wales. She went back there when she married. Roberts, her name is now." "That's right. You can't give me her address, I suppose?" "I borrowed a raincoat from her and forgot to give it back. If I had her address, I'd post it to her." "Well, now, I believe I can. I get a postcard from her now and then. She and her husband have gone into service together. Wait a minute now. She went away and rummaged in a corner. Presently she returned with a piece of paper in her hand. Here you are. Bobby and Frankie read it together. It was the last thing in the world they expected. Mrs. Roberts, The Vicarage, Marchbolt, Wales. Chapter 33. Sensation in the Orient Cafe. How Bobby and Frankie got out of the post office without disgracing themselves, neither of them ever knew. Outside, with one accord, they looked at each other and shook with laughter. "At the vicarage, all the time," gasped Bobby. "And I looked through 480 Evanses," lamented Frankie. "Now I see why Bassington French was so amused when he realised we didn't know in the least who Evans was. And of course it was dangerous from their point of view. You and Evans were actually under the same roof. Come on, Marchbolt's the next place. Like where the rainbow ends, back to dear old home. Dash it all, we've got to do something about Badger. Have you any money, Frankie?" She opened her bag and took out a handful of notes. "Give these to him. Tell him to make some arrangement with his creditors, and then Father will buy the garage and put him in as manager." "All right. The great thing is to get off quickly." "Why the frightful haste?" "I don't know, but I've got a feeling something might happen." "How awful. Let's go ever so quickly." "I'll settle Badger. You go and start the car." "I shall never buy that toothbrush." 5 minutes saw them speeding out of Chipping Somerton. Bobby had no occasion to complain of lack of speed. Nevertheless, Frankie suddenly said, "Look here, Bobby, this isn't quick enough." Bobby glanced at the speedometer dial, which was at the moment registering 80. "I don't see what more we can do." "We can take an air taxi. We're only about 7 miles from Medeshot Aerodrome." "My dear girl, if we do that we'll be home in a couple of hours." "Good. Let's take an air taxi." The whole proceedings were beginning to take on the fantastic charm of a dream. Why this wild hurry to get to Marchbolt, Bobby didn't know. He suspected Frankie didn't either. It was just a feeling. At Medeshot, Frankie asked for Mr. Donald King, and an untidy-looking gentleman was produced, who appeared languidly surprised at the sight of her. Frankie, haven't seen you for an age. What do you want?" "I want an air taxi. You do that sort of thing, don't you?" "Oh, yes. Where do you want to go?" "I want to get home quickly." "Huh? Is that all?" Mr. Donald King raised his eyebrows. "Not quite, but it is the main idea." "Well, I can soon fix you up there." "I'll give you a cheque." 5 minutes later, they were off. "Frankie, why are we doing this?" "I haven't the faintest idea, but I feel we must, don't you?" "Curiously enough, I do, but I don't know why. After all, Mrs. Roberts won't fly away on a broomstick." "She might. Remember, we don't know what Bassington French is up to." "That's true." It was growing late when they reached their destination. The plane landed them in the park, and 5 minutes later Bobby and Frankie were driving into Marchbolt in Lord Marchington's Chrysler. They pulled up outside the vicarage gate, the vicarage drive not lending itself to the turning of expensive cars. Then, jumping out, they ran up the drive. "I shall wake up soon," thought Bobby. "What are we doing, and why?" A slender figure was standing on the doorstep. Frankie and Bobby recognised her at the same minute. "Moira!" cried Frankie. Moira turned. She was swaying slightly. "Oh, I'm so glad to see you. I don't know what to do." "What on earth brings you here?" "The same thing that brought you, I expect." "You found out who Evans is?" "Yes. It's a long story."
"Oh, come inside."
But Moira shrank back. No. Let's go somewhere and talk. There's something I've got to tell you before we go into the house. Isn't there a cafe or some place in the town? Somewhere we could go?"
"All right." Bobby moved unwillingly away from the door. "But why?"
"Oh, you'll see when I tell you. Do come, please. There's not a moment to lose."
They yielded to her urgency. About halfway down the main street was the Orient Cafe, a somewhat grand name, not borne out by the interior decoration. It was a slack moment, 6:30. They sat down at a small table in the corner, and Bobby ordered 3 coffees. "Now then."
"Wait for the waitress. Let's wait till she's brought them."
The waitress returned and listlessly deposited 3 cups of tepid coffee in front of them. "Now then."
"I hardly know where to begin. It was on the train, going to London. Really the most amazing coincidence. I went along the corridor and—"
She broke off. Her seat faced the door, and she leant forward, staring.
"He must have followed me."
"Who?" cried Frankie and Bobby together.
"Bassington French."
You've seen him?
He's outside. I just saw him with a woman with red hair. Mrs. Cayman, cried Frankie.
She and Bobby jumped and ran to the door. A protest came from Moira, but neither of them heeded it. They looked up and down the street, but Bassington French was nowhere in sight. Moira joined them.
Has he gone? Oh, do be careful, he's so dangerous. Horribly dangerous.
He can't do anything so long as we're all together.
Brace up, Moira. Don't be such a rabbit.
Well, we can't do anything for the moment. Bobby led the way back to the table. Go on with what you were telling us, Moira. He picked up his cup of coffee. Frankie lost her balance and fell against him, and the coffee poured over the table.
Sorry.
She stretched over the adjoining table, which was laid for possible diners. There was a cruet on it with 2 glass-stoppered bottles containing oil and vinegar. Frankie's proceedings riveted Bobby's attention, for she took the vinegar bottle, emptied out the vinegar into the slop bowl, and began to pour coffee into it from her cup. Have you gone batty, Frankie? What the devil are you doing?
Just taking a sample of the coffee for George Arbuthnot to analyse.
She turned to Moira.
Because the game's up, Moira. The whole thing came to me in a flash as we stood at the door just now. When I jogged Bobby's elbow and made him spill his coffee, I saw your face. You put something in our cups when you sent us running to the door to look for Bassington French. The game's up, Mrs. Nicholson, or Templeton, or whatever you like to call yourself.
Templeton? Cried Bobby.
Look at her face. If she denies it, ask her to come to the vicarage and see if Mrs. Roberts doesn't identify her.
Bobby did look at her. He saw that face, that haunting, wistful face, transformed by a demonic rage. That beautiful mouth opened, and a stream of foul and hideous curses poured out. She fumbled in her handbag. Bobby was still dazed, but he acted in the nick of time. It was his hand that struck the pistol up. The bullet passed over Frankie's head and buried itself into the wall of the Orient Café. For the first time in its history, one of the waitresses hurried. With a wild scream, she shot out into the street, calling,
"Help! Murder! Police!"
Chapter 34. Letter from South America. It was some weeks later. Frankie had just received a letter. It bore the stamp of one of the less well-known South American republics. After reading it through, she passed it to Bobby. It ran as follows. Dear Frankie, really, I congratulate you. You and your young naval friend have shattered the plans of a lifetime. I had everything so nicely arranged. Would you really like to hear all about it? My lady friend has given me away so thoroughly. Spite, I'm afraid. Women are invariably spiteful. My most damning admissions won't do me any further harm. Besides, I'm starting life again. Roger Bassington French is dead. I fancy I've always been what they call a wrong-un. Even at Oxford I had a little lapse. Stupid, because it was bound to be found out. The pater didn't let me down, but he sent me to the colonies. I fell in with Moira and her lot fairly soon. She was the real thing. She was an accomplished criminal by the time she was 15. When I met her, things were getting a bit too hot for her. The American police were on her trail. She and I liked each other. We decided to make a match of it, but we'd a few plans to carry through first. To begin with, she married Nicholson. By doing so, she removed herself to another world, and the police lost sight of her. Nicholson was just coming over to England to start a place for nerve patients. He was looking for a suitable house to buy cheap. Moira got him onto the Grange. She was still working in with her gang in the dope business, and without knowing it, Nicholson was very useful to her. I always had 2 ambitions. I wanted to be the owner of Merowe, and I wanted to command an immense amount of money. The Bassington French played a great part in the reign of Charles II. Since then, the family has dwindled down to mediocrity, and I felt capable of playing a great part again. But I had to have money. Moira made several trips across to Canada to see her people. Nicholson adored her and believed anything she told him. Most men did. Owing to the complications of the drug business, she travelled under various names. She was travelling as Mrs. Templeton when she met Savage. She knew all about Savage and his enormous wealth, and went all out for him. He was attracted, but he wasn't attracted enough to lose his common sense. However, we concocted a plan. You know pretty well the story of that. The man you know as Cayman acted the part of the unfeeling husband. The savage was induced to come down and stay at Tudor Cottage more than once, and the third time he came, our plans were laid. Well, I needn't go into all that, you know it. The whole thing went with a bang. Moira cleared the money and went off ostensibly abroad. In reality, back to Staveley and the Grange. In the meantime, I was perfecting my own plans. Henry and young Tommy had to be got out of the way. I had bad luck over Tommy. A couple of perfectly good accidents went wrong. And I wasn't going to fool about with accidents in Henry's case. He had a good deal of rheumatic pain after an accident in the hunting field, so I introduced him to morphia. He took it in all good faith. Henry was a simple soul. He soon became an addict. Our plan was that he should go to the Grange for treatment, and should there either commit suicide or get hold of an overdose of morphia. Moira would do the business. I should not be connected in any way. And then that fool Carstairs began to get active. It seems Savage had written him a line on board ship, mentioning Mrs. Templeton, even enclosing a snapshot of her. Carstairs went on a shooting trip soon afterwards, but when he came back from the wilds and heard the news of Savage's death and will, he was frankly incredulous. The story didn't ring true to him. He was certain Savage wasn't worried about his death, and he didn't believe he had any special fear of cancer. Also, the wording of the will sounded to him highly uncharacteristic. Savage was a hard-headed businessman, and while he might be quite ready to have an affair with a pretty woman, Carstairs did not believe he would ever leave a vast sum of money to her, and the rest to charity. The charity touch was my idea. It sounded so respectable and unfishy. Carstairs came over here, determined to look into the business, and began to poke about. Straight away we had a piece of bad luck. Some friends brought him down to lunch, and he saw a picture of Moira on the piano. He recognised it as the woman on the snapshot that Savage sent him. He went down to Chipping Somerton and started to poke about there. Moira and I began to get the wind up. I sometimes think unnecessarily, but Carstairs was a shrewd chap. I went down to Chipping Somerton after him. He failed to trace the cook, Rose Chudley. She'd gone to the north, but he tracked down Evans, found out her married name, and started off for Marchbolt. Things were getting serious. If Evans identified Mrs. Templeton and Mrs. Nicholson as one and the same person, matters were going to become difficult. Also, she'd been in the house some time. We weren't sure quite how much she might know. I decided Carstairs had got to be suppressed. He was making a serious nuisance of himself. Chance came to my aid. I was close behind him when the mist came up. I crept up nearer, and a sudden push did the job. But I was still in a dilemma. I didn't know what incriminating matter he might have on him. However, your young naval friend played into my hands very nicely. I was left alone with the body for a short time, quite enough for my purpose. He had a photograph of Moira. He'd got it from the photographers, presumably for identification. I removed it and any letters or identifying matter. Then I planted the photograph of one of the gang. All went well. The pseudo-sister and brother-in-law came down and identified him. All seemed to have gone off satisfactorily. And then your friend Bobby upset things. It seemed that Carstairs had recovered consciousness before he died, and that he had been saying things. He'd mentioned Evans, and Evans was actually in service at the vicarage. I must admit we were getting rattled by now. We lost our heads a bit. Moira insisted that you had to be put out of the way. We tried one plan, which failed. Then Moira said she'd see to it. She went down to Marchbolt in the car, seized a chance very neatly, slipped some morphia into Bobby's beer when he was asleep. The young devil didn't succumb. That was pure bad luck. As I told you, it was Nicholson's cross-questioning that made me wonder if you were not what you seemed. But imagine the shock that Moira had when she was creeping out to meet me one evening and came face to face with Bobby. She recognised him at once. She'd had a good look when he was asleep that day. No wonder she was so scared she nearly passed out. Then she realised it wasn't her he suspected. She rallied and played up. She came to the inn and told him a few tall stories. He swallowed them like a lamb. She pretended Alan Carstairs was an old lover and piled it on thick about her fear of Nicholson. Also, she did her best to disabuse you of your suspicions concerning me. I did the same to you, and disparaged her as a weak, helpless creature. Moira, who had the nerve to put any number of people out of the way without turning a hair. The position was serious. We'd got the money, we were getting on well with the Henry plan, and I was in no hurry for Tommy. I could afford to wait a bit. Nicholson could easily be got out of the way when the time came. But you and Bobby were a menace. You'd got your suspicions fixed on the Grange. It may interest you to know that Henry did not commit suicide. I killed him. When I was talking to you in the garden, I saw there was no time to waste, so I went straight in and sorted things. The aeroplane that came over gave me my chance. I went into the study, sat down by Henry, who was writing, and said, "Look here, old man," and shot him. The noise of a plane drowned the sound. Then I wrote a nice, affecting letter, wiped off my fingerprints from the revolver, pressed Henry's hand round it, and let it drop to the floor. I put the key of the study in Henry's pocket and went out, locking the door from the outside with the dining-room key, which fits the lock. I won't go into details of the neat little squib arrangement in the chimney, which was timed to go off 4 minutes later. Everything went beautifully. You and I were in the garden together and heard the shot. A perfect suicide. The only person who laid himself open to suspicion was poor old Nicholson. The ass came back for a stick or something. Of course, Bobby's night-errantry was a bit difficult for Moira, so she just went off to the cottage. We fancied Nicholson's explanation of his wife's absence would be sure to make you suspicious. Where Moira really showed her mettle was at the cottage. She realised from the noise upstairs that I'd been knocked out, and she quickly injected a large dose of morphia into herself and lay down on the bed. After you all went down to the telephone, she nipped up to the attic and cut me free. Then the morphia took effect, and by the time the doctor arrived, she was genuinely off in an hypnotic sleep. But all the same, her nerve was going. She was afraid you'd get on to Evans and have the hang of how Savage's will and suicide was worked. Also, she was afraid Carstairs had written to Evans before he came to Marchbold. She pretended to go up to a London nursing home. Instead, she hurried down to Marchbold, and met you on the doorstep. Then her one idea was to get you both out of the way. Her methods were crude to the last degree, but I believe she would have got away with it. I doubt the waitress would have been able to remember much about the woman who came in with you. Moira would have got away to London and lain low in the nursing home. With you and Bobby out of the way, the whole thing would have died down. But you spotted her, and she lost her head, and then at the trial she dragged me into it. Perhaps I was getting a little tired of her. But I had no idea she knew it. You see, she had got the money, my money. Once I had married her, I might have got tired of her. I like variety. So, here I am, starting life again. And all owing to you and that extremely objectionable young man, Bobby Jones. But I've no doubt I shall make good. Or ought it to be bad, not good? I haven't reformed yet. But if at first you don't succeed, try again. Goodbye, my dear. Or perhaps au revoir. One never knows, does one? Your affectionate enemy, a bold, bad villain of the piece, Roger Bassington French. Chapter 35. News from the vicarage. Bobby handed back the letter, and with a sigh, Frankie took it. He's really a very remarkable person. You always had a fancy for him. He had charm. So had Moira. Bobby blushed. It was very queer that all the time the clue to the whole thing should have been in the vicarage. You do know, don't you, Frankie, that Carstairs had actually written to Evans, to Mrs. Roberts, that is? Frankie nodded, telling her that he was coming to see her, and that he wanted information about Mrs. Templeton, whom he had reason to believe was a dangerous international crook wanted by the police. And then when he's pushed over the cliff, she doesn't put two and two together. Well, that's because the man who went over the cliff was Pritchard. That identification was a very clever bit of work. If a man called Pritchard is pushed over, how could you know it was a man called Carstairs? I mean, that's how the ordinary mind works. The funny thing is that she recognised Cayman. At least she caught a glimpse of him when Roberts was letting him in, and asked him who it was. And he said it was Mr. Cayman, and she said, "Funny, he's the dead spit of a gentleman I used to be in service with." Can you beat it? Even Bassington French gave himself away once or twice, but like an idiot I never spotted it. Did he? Yes. When Sylvia said that the picture in the paper was very like Carstairs, he said there wasn't much likeness really, showing he'd seen the dead man, and then later he said to me he'd never saw the dead man's face. How on earth did you spot Moira, Frankie? I think it was the description of Mrs. Templeton. Everyone said she was such a nice lady. Now that didn't seem to fit with the Cayman woman,
No servant would describe her as a nice lady. And when we got to the vicarage and Moira was there, it suddenly came to me. Suppose Moira was Mrs. Templeton. It's very bright of you. Sorry for Sylvia, with Moira dragging Roger into it. It's been a terrible lot of publicity for her. But Dr. Nicholson has stuck by her. I shouldn't be at all surprised if he ended by making a match of it.
Everything seems to have ended very fortunately. Badger's doing well at the garage, thanks to your father, and also thanks to your father, I've got this perfectly marvellous job.
Is it a marvellous job?
Managing a coffee estate out in Kenya on a whacking big screw? I should think so. It's just the sort of thing I used to dream about. People come out to Kenya a good deal on trips.
Really? Quite a lot of people live out there.
Oh, Frankie, you wouldn't. Would you?
I would. I will.
I've been keen about you always, said Bobby in a stifled voice. I used to be miserable, knowing, but it was no good.
I suppose that's what made you so rude that day on the golf links.
Yes, I was feeling pretty grim.
What about Moira?
Bobby looked uncomfortable. Her face did sort of get to me.
It's a better face than mine.
It isn't, but it sort of haunted me. And then when we were up in the attic and you were so plucky about things, well, Moira just faded out. I was hardly interested in what happened to her. You, only you. You were simply splendid. So frightfully plucky.
I wasn't feeling plucky inside. I was all shaking. But I wanted you to admire me.
I did, darling, I do. Always have. I always shall. You sure you won't hate it out in Kenya?
I shall adore it. I was fed up with England.
Frankie, Bobby... If you will come in here, said the vicar, opening the door and ushering in the advance guard of the Dorcas Society. He shut the door precipitately and apologised. One of my sons is engaged. A member of the Dorcas Society said archly that it looked like it. A good boy, inclined at one time not to take life seriously, but he has improved very much of late. He's going out to manage a coffee estate in Kenya, said one member of the Dorcas Society to another in a whisper.
Did you see? It was Lady Frances Derwent he was kissing.
In an hour's time, the news was all over Marchbold. You have been listening to the final instalment and finding out why they didn't ask Evans. It was written by Agatha Christie and read by me, Matthew Jones. Thank you for listening, Story Club members. There will be another Agatha Christie story towards the end of the year.